Hello fellow cinephiles, 90s Film Guru here. Thanks for joining me today. Today I'm looking at a sort of film that's kind of lost that not a lot of people talk about anymore, and it's mainly because it went up against The Matrix, and obviously that became a phenomenon and changed the shape and dynamic of that sort of sci-fi martial arts aspect in cinema. So today I'll be reviewing The 13th Floor. It was directed by Joseph Resnick and starred Craig Bierko, Vincent D'Onofrio, Gretchen Mol, and Armin Bueller-Stallo. The film follows the story of Douglas Hall, a computer scientist that unknowingly gets involved in the murder of his colleague Hannon Fuller, a computer genius who is killed just before the testing of a newly launched virtual reality simulation program. His colleague is murdered due to him trying to expose something that he's learnt on his journey creating this particular simulation. And all eyes turn to Douglas Hall as being the perpetrator of the murder. The detective who's on the case thinks he's the one, and he's trying to put it all together. But as the film unfolds, we start to see that not everything is as it seems, and the simulation is part of something even bigger than Douglas Hall or us really knows. And it's about him trying to piece everything together in order to clear his name and to stop whatever is happening from happening. And it ends with quite a shocking and surprising ending, which I really loved. I remember when this film first came out. I saw it when it came out in 1999 at the cinema, and I was really blown away by it. I was really impressed by it. I thought it was very interesting and clever. I love the story. I love the sort of noir, slow element that it has, which really adds a lot to it. And I like that it was trying something different with the sci-fi genre. Now, the reason, like I mentioned in the opening, why this film didn't do real well is it came up against The Matrix. Now, if you had this and The Matrix against each other, one's obviously shines over the other. I think 13th Floor is a really great concept, and I really like the way the concept is handled and done in this compared to The Matrix. But The Matrix sort of made it a very cinematic and much more profound and effective film that reached a far bigger audience than 13th Floor, but it was a similar concept. But it was just done in a different way. This film is to me a much better concept. I like the way they deal with the simulation, how they create it. I like that we go into the simulation and we see what it looks like, that the colors are slightly drawn out as if it's not trying to point out it's not quite real. And it differs from the reality that we see of Douglas Hall and the characters in the film. There is another element to the movie that comes about later in the film, and that's kind of an interesting way of seeing what the world looks like. And where this film sort of ends up is kind of fascinating as well. I think all the performances are good. I think Craig Bierko, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, I think he's solid in the film. He's an actor I haven't seen a lot of. Usually he plays a villain. Here was something a bit different. There is a bit of a darker aspect to his character that we see later in the movie. But he's sort of much more of a good guy in this compared to something like Long Kiss Goodnight, where he plays the villain in that. And he ultimately would go on to be part of Red Dwarf American remake, which was terrible. Anyway, getting off track. I think he's solid in here and interesting. I think Vincent D'Onofrio is great. What an actor he truly is. He can embrace so much and encompass some very fascinating character, and he adds so much to the roles that he plays. And here he's really great. He's a computer sort of scientist, and he's a really great and fascinating character. And then I like that we see the variation of him once we're in the simulation, and the character he's created for himself in there is really fascinating, and we see such a duality and such completely different characters, and that's just a real testament to Vincent D'Onofrio for his skills as an actor. And he's really one of the standouts in this film. Armin Bueller-Stallo is really great in it. He's an actor I hadn't seen a lot of. Obviously, there's Eastern Promises later in his career, and obviously the X-Files. And I used to get this and X-Files mixed up because he was in both. He plays a very vastly different character in this than he does in the other films. He's much more sympathetic. He sort of reminds me, like they said, he's the modern day Einstein. He kind of has that Einstein look and feel about him, which I really loved. And I think his performance is really solid, even if it is quite limited. But to me, the real standout here is Gretchen Mol. She just has this sort of 1950s, 1940s sort of look and feel. She fits in the noir world really well with her blonde hair and just her way of being. And this is really where I sort of started to take notice of the actress when I first saw the film. She's just really engaging and interesting, and really is a driving force in the movie. And what what she ultimately has to do in the film is really great. And like every other actor in the film, they get to play dual roles. So there's the role of who she really is and this other character that she kind of inhabits. And the same with Douglas Hall and Craig. He's able to play the character who's playing Douglas Hall, but also a variation of that within the simulation. And they're just really able to add so much differences to these characters, and I really loved that aspect of the movie. The film was made for 16 million and went on to make only 18.5 million, so it wasn't that successful, and I can see kind of why it's sort of forgotten, besides the fact it went up against The Matrix. It's just a film that is sort of slipped through the cracks in a lot of ways. It's like, I just feel there's a lot of concepts in regards to sci-fi that have sort of done something similar, but this was sort of the springboard for that, and I think it's something that really needs to be re-looked at. Now, originally, it's based on a book, Simulacrum 3, I think it's called. So it's based on that book, written by Daniel F. Galois. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So it's based on his book that ultimately was turned into a TV series back in 1973 by German filmmaker Rainer Werner Fassbinder. And he sort of created this German version of it, which is ultimately what inspired the film. And I think in regards to it being a miniseries, I think that could work a lot better. I feel this is something that could be re-looked at. As a film, it's too short to really get into the depth and understanding of what the story is about and how to explain certain things. There are certain things we learn throughout the film that are really just touched upon and never really dove into. And the film kind of leaves you with a lot of questions, like, can they, if they go into the simulation and transfer the consciousness into that character and into the simulation, can that character come out of the simulation and become them in the real world? And does it have to be that particular person that their consciousness has to go into and ultimately to mimic them in that world? It kind of makes much more sense, I suppose, if they transfer their consciousness into someone like them that they've created. Then it's like them experiencing the world for themselves rather than them consciousness going into another body, and that doesn't look or feel familiar, and that character doesn't quite have the same experience. So that kind of makes sense, I guess, in a way. But I just feel like a miniseries or TV series could really expand this in a really interesting way. I think this is something could really re-looked at now and done in a 6-part series on Netflix or a much longer series, and be sort of in the vein a little bit of like 12 Monkeys, the TV series, certain aspects of it, obviously not the time travel stuff, but there is certain looks and feels and concepts in that TV show that could really work for this turning this into a TV series. It was produced by Roland Emmerich, and it feels like a film that he could have done, and for such a long time since I've seen this last, I always thought he did direct it, but he didn't, he only produced it, but it does feel like something he would do. And was really at the point when, just before the 2000s, just when all these sort of sci-fi concepts were coming out and trying to see and think about what the world would become in 2000 with the Y2K and all that sort of stuff, the fear of the world ending, and what that would look like, and what a futuristic version of our world would look like further into the future. It's visually striking, like I mentioned, when we go into the simulation, the colours are drawn out, but it really feels like the 1937 or 1940s, even they use matte paintings and sort of old school techniques that they used to use in the 50s and 60s and earlier. And I kind of like that. It sort of gives it an interesting feel and look. And I like the world we're introduced to and the characters in that. I like I love the costumes and just the interactions that people have with each other in it, and just how they've created this idea of how realistic simulation could ultimately become, and I love that as well. In the present world is well done as well, and just the design of the simulation, this huge, this whole floor full of different computers and different hard drives and crafting something. Saying it needs a lot of these things to create what it's creating, and it kind of feels like back when early days of computers in a lot of ways, even though this is sort of a newer version of that concept. It's just the way that they depict this particular computer system that kind of reminds me of the old huge systems they usually have with computers, which was a whole room, and that's kind of what this concept looks at. I like the slow pace, the murder mystery aspect of it. Like, you know, this guy Fuller gets killed, and is Douglas Hall the character that we're following, the main character, the protagonist? Did he have something to do with it? And if so, why can't he remember? And there's sort of that sort of what's really going on, and which I really loved. And films like this really fascinate me because it allows me to invest my time into it, to become a participant rather than just an observer, and to really try and piece things together as the characters do, which is something that makes the film, much like the concept, a very interactive experience. And I like the twist in the film when particular characters find out that the simulation isn't real and they're not real, and what they end up doing to see that the fact that their world isn't completely real, and how that reflects what Douglas Hall does in the film. And it really starts to question so many things about what we're seeing. Is it real? Is it not real? What is the real world? What isn't? And it's sort of, even though it introduces these really interesting ideas, it's just too short to really delve into them, like I said a moment ago. And I think that's what lets the film down a little bit. I still really love it, but it does let it down in general audiences wouldn't be able to really get the most out of it because of the fact that they don't dive into it too much. There are that I've read where they've talked about how it was a confusing plot and convoluted and all these things, and I can see that, but they were trying to do something in a limited time, and that's the issue with it. And like I mentioned, it leaves you with asking so many more questions. And if it's possible for the simulation character to come into the real world, how does that work? If that character dies in the simulation, does that consciousness from that character go into the other character, and the character that has gone into that simulation has really died? It gets complicated, and me trying to explain it probably complicates it more, but there's so many questions that I have with it, and it's a film that I've rewatched and picked up bits and pieces, but I just see it in a different way now, and that sort of has a different impact on me due to all the movies that I have seen, and my connection with The Matrix, and how I really love that film, and how I really love the concept, and how looking at that and this film, they're sort of on par with each other, hence why they came out at the same time. But they just take the concept and just do something completely different with it. One is far more entertaining than the other. But where 13th Floor is much more of a thought-provoking movie in a lot of ways, where The Matrix kind of explains everything so we really know what's happening once Neo is awoken into the real world. We see what's going on, and it's all explained to him. With this film, it really is about us trying to piece it together, to try and come up with our own concept, and to try and think about what the film's really saying and trying to tell us, and really think about the world that we live in and the idea of what if it isn't real. This is a film, if you haven't seen it, I do highly recommend it. It is a very interesting movie, and if you like something that's thought-provoking, that has a sci-fi concept and ideas, this is definitely worth checking out. Final thoughts. In the end, this is probably one of the most fascinating films that I've seen, that I own, that I return to. And while it has its flaws, it really is a very fascinating and interesting and unique film in its execution of the idea of us being in a simulation, and has been buried underneath the popularity and cultural phenomenon that The Matrix ultimately became. And it became much more accessible than this film is in regards to its ideas and concepts. Anyway, that's all from me today. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe down the bottom, follow me on Letterboxd and Facebook. Otherwise, until next time, enjoy the movies.